I'm Cleve Thibodeaux. I've been living in Erath now for 55 years. I'm 87 years old, and I'm asked to talk about the Hurricane Hilda. And I guess we could start off with about 2 days before the storm, we had a meeting, the civil defense people, and we organized to vacate the town. I think just about 95% of the people had left town, and I was kind of crippled. I stepped off of a ladder and I had a sprained ankle. So it decided Joe Brown would ride with me around town, patrol the town at night. Joe and I would patrol the town at night, and periodically I'd come in the house here and plot the hurricane supposed to have come in that night, but it did not. It went back and forth in the Gulf. So about 5 o'clock we decided just to come back and rest. The following day, I remember meeting with Dr. Swear, and because Joe Brown had been a military policeman and the deputy sheriff, if we'd have seen something going on, he would have known how to arrest somebody. I would not. So we decided to deputize Joe Brown. And so that night again, Joe and I patrolled the town, and then the next afternoon, we're in town when we're going around. The civil defense people were going around taking branches off of the electrical line that they felt, keep the electricity in town. But must have been about 4 o'clock in the afternoon when electricity went out. I remember Joe and I were out there by the about where they have the new water treatment plant, and we heard on the radio that electricity was out all over town. I heard on my radio in my truck. I had a CB radio, and so we met back in City Hall, and we determined that for fire protection, that we should keep the water tower full of water. It had overflowed a few minutes before, so we knew it was full. So for fire protection, we closed the water off, and we congregated, talked in there. Somebody had a little generator that started off, had a little TV in that little building under the tower, and we're in City Hall. Then I decided to go and take care of my family. They were in Dr. Swear's store. That's where they had spent 2 nights. I'm right, Cleve? I think they spent 2 nights there. But anyway, I go there and they informed me we had cut the water off. They couldn't make any coffee. So we had stored some water in the house. Bessie told me to come and get some jug of water to bring back for them to make coffee. And on my way back, I was checking the antenna on my TV business, and looking through the water tower, I saw the first guy wire snap. And then the little rivets started popping like shotguns. One of them went through the door of my truck. And I was fighting to go against the wind, and the truck didn't have too much power. And then there was Mr. Black and Goose Stereo and Bull Thibodeaux, and I think your daddy, Pig Wheel, running out of that little building. I had to slow down again. In other words, they delayed me. And then I saw the water tower twisting, coming down. And so immediately I went around by the old, we made it in the parish auto parts. I swung around so the wind blowing. Mr. Black came and talked to me. And I said, what does it look like? He said, they all got killed, he said. And so I got on the radio, and because everybody was always talking on that CB radio. It was a jam session like. But the moment I cut in, I called for Gerald Shasto in Delcom. I knew he was in communication with Abbeville. I said, Gerald, I said, this is Mr. Cleve. That's how he used to call me. Everybody quit talking. In other words, I had a free talk to them. They knew there was an emergency of some kind. So I told him, I said, our water tower fell on City Hall and we have 3 men trapped. I said, we need some heavy equipment to lift the tower off. I didn't want to say how bad I thought it was, not to alarm people who were out of town with their relatives in town who they knew were. And when I got through, I immediately came back in front of City Hall, and Wilma Dugas was one of our policemen. He had a CB radio, and they were removing a branch off of the line in front of Mr. Mabel Segura's home. And he heard me. He drove back. He was there before, and he came to my car and he says, "Don't you have a hydraulic jacks? We got some men trapped." I said, "Yeah, I got them in the back of the truck." Looking back, I realized I'd unloaded them to bring my brother's freezer in the garage here. So I immediately came back, got the jacks, brought them back, and was able to free Joe Schicksenhauer was strapped, and Marshall Broussard. And of course, I didn't know anybody else in there because I didn't get on because I could hardly walk. I had a hard time walking. And after that, well, I guess I went back to the store to tell Dr. Swear and then what had happened. And I only told Dr. Swear and my wife what had happened. None of the others in the store knew it. Of course, it was quite a sad story. And Roy Young sent a big truck to come in, a big winch, derrick thing to try to lift the thing up. But the wind was so strong, and he was afraid that his derrick would fall over. So they gave up trying to rescue anybody else, but nobody else there was no chance anybody had survived. And I remember I parked my truck next to the Western Auto building, and what's his name, Corbett Domain, would come back and forth and report to me, you know, what was happening. I was in communication with other people. And after a while he came back, "Did you see Uncle Joe?" I said, "No, I hadn't seen him since I'd left him in the City Hall." So then we all congregated in the back to decide what next to do. And everybody was discussing who was in such and such a place, you know, in the building. And finally I asked Monkey, I said, "Monkey," I said, "You see Joe Brown?" He said, "That's the one in that yellow raincoat in such a place in the corner." In other words, they identified everybody but Joe Brown. And nobody else had thought about poor Joe Brown. He was one of the victims. And I went back to the store, and we could receive calls on the phone, but we couldn't send out. And one of the Dubois girls asked me if I'd seen their daddy. I said no. And he was one of the victims. I guess about 5 o'clock in the morning, the winds had subsided. We all went out and started collecting the stuff. They started taking the bodies out. It must have been at 5 o'clock in the morning. It wasn't daylight yet. And I remember seeing my 2 jacks, not my 2 jacks I had borrowed, on Mr. Chibik's store, on the step. I remember seeing both of them. When I went to collect them, only one was left. Somebody had taken off with Rodney's jack, a 20-ton jack, brand new jack. It disappeared and never came back. But that's just another thing. And after all the bodies were removed, I decided to try to collect as much of the papers for the town that I could salvage, that was salvageable. They were wet, but Newby gave us a store to go in. He had a big spot we could go out there and spread them out to dry out. And while collecting that, that's when we lifted up the, Kearney had come and he gave me 2 National Guard bars to help me out. And so when they lifted the desk cover, under there was a leg with a shoe and a part of a pants, and I didn't recognize the pants was one of the Broussard boys. After the lights went on, he had gone home, changed, put some dry clothes on, because it was one of them that was working in the rain, and I recognized the pants he had put on, some striped pants that was odd, you know. So I recognized immediately what it was. So I sent somebody with the leg to the warehouse where they were storing, taking care of the bodies, and we collected everything we could, and of course it was quite a very sad thing. I mean, the next thing I remember doing was Father Swallow had told me he was going to his folks in Washington, and so we couldn't get in contact with him on the phone. So a state police drove up, I stopped him, and I went and asked him if he could get in touch with him, which he started talking with other police on the radio. Finally, he contacted Father Swallow. Okay, and I don't know where Monsignor Barabee was, but some kind of way, I guess he got the news and he came in. The next morning for the funeral, Governor McKeithen came. I went and picked him up at the airport and drove him through town, showed him all the bad spots, and that's about when the funeral was starting to go on. I brought Governor McKeithen back, and in the whole thing, we had a drag line from the highway department to pick up all the debris so that we could restore our water line. And he promised me that he'd leave the drag line as long as we wanted. That afternoon, the drag line was gone. Politics had taken it away from us. But we were able to get the water restored that afternoon, I think. Kind of through the National Guard, got a generator. When in the meantime, the Caldwell had drilled a well for that water tower, and the town had put the water pump on it and were furnishing what to keep up the well. So that we were able to start that well out there while we were trying to. 8-ton Stewart came and welded the pipe to reconnect the water well back of the city hall. And late that afternoon, we had promised the people they'd have water at a certain time, but we still had no water. So I'd take a ride. I went out there, and the tower was overflowing. They couldn't figure out why there was no water in town. I said, well, looking for a valve. I said, I don't know where it is. So they went digging in the grass. They found a valve to open a valve to let the water come into town. And we had a few comic experience too. Another time, after we got the water well going, it had too much pressure. We were busting the water lines. So I got in touch with Mr. Arsenault with Stam Sheely. And either he came, I think he came personally and brought a pop-off valve. And we hooked up on the hydrant in front of Mr. Sears' home. And we let that thing run until we had our new water tower restored. We'd let the pump run constantly and let the water flow, keeping the pressure down. Let enough water out as we went. At the same time, one morning I was getting ready to go to Baton Rouge for some reason for the town, and I got a call from what's his name, Hebert. He was an electrician. Virgil, that he couldn't understand what was wrong. The sand was coming out from around the well out there by the tower, and he says, I can't stop the pump. I pull the fuses out and pull the switch out, the pump's still running, he says. I go out there, I start laughing. I said, stop that valve that you had to open. The water was going back into the well and running the pump. That's what he thought the pump was running. So he put new fuses and restored it, let it go back on. We had little experiences like that. Then we had the engineer who was in charge of the Blacktop Road. When the Blacktop was in town about 3 or 4 years before, tried to get in touch with me, but I was always busy being in town. He never could touch. So he got in touch with George LeBlanc, our former mayor. He told me for me to contact him, which I did. He said, we have a new water tower to be ready to be installed at Macon, Mississippi. He said, I'm sure the people out there would delay for us to rebuild another one for them and let you all have this one before it can find the finances. The town didn't have the money for that at all. We had a meeting that afternoon in Lafayette with some federal officials, and I met Bob LeBlanc, and I told him my predicament, that I could get a water tower, and if we could get the finances. So he went and talked to those guys. A few minutes after that, he brings a guy in. He says, tell your fella that you can get the tower, the relief program or whatever it was, we'll pay for it. I said, what about the installation? He said, that's including installation and a water main to connect and everything. They'd pay for the whole thing. So, of course, Dr. Sweary was very elated. We were all happy. There was Dr. Sweary and I, and what was the name? The two secretaries. One, people I know so well.
Mrs. Lee?
Who?
Mrs. Lee?
One was Alton Maynard's wife, Carrie Ann, and the other one was Toots' wife, Simon. She was a Simon. In the meantime, they had let us, the Simon had let us have their little store for a temporary city hall. You remember that would be on Bork and what's that other street? Is that Jen Street? I don't know, that little store, so that's what we were using as City Hall. So that night we had a meeting, and it was where we were going to put the town. Nobody wanted it back in town. We had to put it out of town. So we had contacted Mr. Nunez, Mr. Walter Nunez, but he wanted, I think, $4,000 for an acre, and also needed a bridge that would have cost about $8,000 to cross the coulee. So that was kind of out of the question. So I asked Mr. Alec Thibodeaux, who was a councilman, I said, why don't you contact the Caldwell about getting, oh no, he wasn't going to contact him. And I said, maybe he was calling himself the waterman for the town. I said, why don't you go to see him? Oh, I can't talk to those people. I said, well, I'll go. So the next morning, I went out to the office. I knew when Mr. Charlie and Mr. Paul Morrissey would meet. I go down, walked in there, and of course they greeted me how things were going. So I told them that we had a problem about a location to put the water tower. I said, I came to see if we could put it back of Paul's house. I says, could you have a lot? Could you buy a lot from you? Charlie says, buy, hell, we'll give it to you. And he said, hey, Paul? You know, he pointed out to Paul Morrissey, and Paul Morrissey couldn't have said no if you wanted to, the way Charlie presented him. So he came out and brought out a map, because they have all that land divided into lots. I don't know whether you're aware or not. So he brought out the map. He said, we have lots there, 75 by 150. How about 2 lots? It'd be 150 by 150. I said, well, that'll be suitable. We'll just set an acre for have enough acreage. So he said, well, before we do that, he says, we'll have to get Mr. Pete's approval too. So he sent Irene LeBlanc to the machine shop to get Mr. Pete's. So when Mr. Pete's, we explained to him, he said he approved 100%. So Mr. Paul asked, he said, when's your next meeting? I said, tonight. He says, I'll have the papers ready for you tonight. So he had Paul Jr. prepare the papers, and that night they awarded it to us. Then the next thing was to clear the lot because that sugar cane growing. I don't think that the refinery wasn't running yet. That was the beginning of October. Normally they started in the middle of October. So it was to get the sugar cane out. I meet Louis Bourque, in town, and he was planting sugarcane. I said, "Don't you need some cane to plant?" He said, "I could use some." So I told him about the story of that. He was the one that had those children that they were raising. What they call them?
Foster children.
Foster children. So he came there with about 5 or 6 foster children. I lent him my tractor, the Caldwell lent a tractor, and 2 carts. So they'd cut that thing, because not only that, the Caldwell sent a survey to plot off the lot. So we knew exactly where to go and cut the sugar cane. And in the meantime, then Mr. let me see, I'm trying to think of his name, got the contract for making the foundation. After the sugar cane went out, they leveled off the ground, and he came and laid out the foundation. And when the tower was ready to put up, well, the engineer would come, at least twice a week while the tower was going up, and I'd pick him up at the airport and bring him here. And he'd come in his plane, the company plane, I guess they had.
Let me back up and go back to the hurricane. And before the water tower fell, you had been inside City Hall.
Oh, yes.
Can you talk about and tell me what it was like, what people were doing, who was doing what the mood was in City Hall? Because we don't know too many stories of that.
Well, there wasn't much going on, because, I mean, just the wind was blowing and nobody was going outside, and we just talking about what we had done and what would probably have to be done later on. Our plans were to go back and clean all the lines for when electricity would come back on, make sure we'd have electricity. That was a plan that the Civil Defense was making. I was not a member of the Civil Defense team, but I did have a Civil Defense card by virtue of being a chairman of the Selective Service Board.
But if you could remember some things that were taking place, who was doing what, where people were. I always heard there were people sleeping in the jails.
Oh, well, they weren't sleeping. They were just, when the water tower fell, there were 2 people in the back, New Day Tron, and let me see, New Day Tron was in back there. He escaped through the back door, and there was another old gentleman, I'm trying to think of his name, that escaped too, in the back, through the back door. The jail had a back door, and they escaped through that. But they were just happened to be further back from where the water tower to be able to escape. Poor Carboy and Joe Brown apparently were the 2 last ones. All the others were further in. I mean, the City Hall had quite a few chairs, and we all sitting around in there. And I was in there with him when I left. If my family wouldn't have been in town, I probably would have been a victim, because I wouldn't take off and go out and work on the line, because I was kind of crippled. I wouldn't have ventured out. And I don't know how Joe Brown hadn't taken off with him when they found out there was a branch on the line by Mr. Mayor Segura. In fact, what's his name, Father Charles, later on told me that he had talked to Joe Brown. Apparently just before the tower fell, he had called City Hall and talked to his uncle. And apparently Joe Brown might have been on the phone when the others left. That might be why he got trapped. He didn't get to leave with the others.
And of the people that got killed, what were their job duties? What were they actually doing?
Well, some of them were patrolling the town, and others were working to keep the lines clean. Seeing that branches fell in the street, they'd take them out and keep the town straightened out. It was Civil Defense boys. Monkey Sandals was in charge, and there was Lee Bernard and Leo, Virgil Hebert, and Clifton Dugas, and the 2 Broussard boys. And we're all working as a team.
Scotty Bernard was a
Scotty
ham
Bernard
radio
was
operator.
a radio operator. He had set himself up in the back in the event electricity went out. He had batteries in the back, upstairs in the back. But he was down there, and this, Marshall had come to relieve him. And Scotty got trapped, and Marshall got... And a funny thing, when you see somebody testifying to something in court, I'll never forget when I saw Joe Schickliner, when I passed in front, when Wilma told me Joe was strapped, I could see him pivot on one leg, you know. And the next week when I saw him in town, I could have sworn it was the other leg he was pivoting around. It was just one of those things how your mind don't record everything. But I'm taking all this. That was what, 38 years ago?
1964.
In 64. So you know, it's quite a few years back, but it's still vivid in my mind. After the next day, I was always all over. What's the name? LeBlanc, on the council today.
John Earl.
John Earl. John Earl reminded me more of me for Hurricane Lily. Everywhere you went for Hurricane Lily, there was John Earl. I mean, he was a busy bee. I guess I was about the same as him at the time. It reminded me. In fact, I told him he reminded me of my experience.
If this accident happened today, you know there would be numerous lawsuits. And in those days, were there any lawsuits filed?
Well, the only thing I can remember, I don't think there was a lawsuit. There was a hearing on the water tower while they were removing the tower. You see, I had somebody with a cutting torch cut two of those turnbuckles that was really corroded, that you could tell it was in dire need of repairing, which had not been done. And the town had a firm that used to come on a yearly basis inspect the tower. They'd come in May and gave us a clean bill of health that the tower was in good shape. And so I kept those two turnbuckles hidden in the abandoned shower we had in the house here. I had it hidden I didn't want anybody to get it. So when there was a hearing, I was notified to appear before a hearing in the courthouse and to bring any pertinent equipment that or anything that could have been as evidence. And I'll never forget, Nolan Sandoz called me in his office here in Dr. Swear because I'd brought those things. He said, "Why didn't you reveal that to me?" And I said, "Nobody asked me about it." I said, "They asked me to bring stuff, and I brought it." And so at the hearing, I told him what my experience was, and that we had the tower inspected, but the tower went back. I mean, the company that inspected the tower went bankrupt the day after the tower fell. In other words, they knew they were in violation. They knew that what shape the tower was in. And then there was another fellow who wanted to come and repair the tower. He claimed that the base of the tower itself, was pitted, corroded, very corroded, which I saw the evidence. He was right about that. But I met him on the street. He says, "That's an act of God." In other words, he didn't want to be blamed for anything else because he probably knew the condition the tower was in. And
those turnbuckles today are where?
I don't know. I left him at and there was at the hearing. There was Scotty's mother and father was at the hearing, and let's see, Edward LeBlanc, the attorney, was there. I don't know who he was representing. And I presume Nolan Sandoz was representing the town. But I didn't hear any other testimony but mine. In other words, and I told him what my experience was, and that I had brought that because I knew it was not the town's fault, because we had tried to protect ourselves. the tower had been inspected. In fact, I collected the evidence where I had the paper that I salvaged that signed that the tower was in good shape in May. It couldn't have corroded that bad come October.
So you don't know where those turnbuckles are?
I have no earthly idea. I wish I knew.
And who was conducting the hearings?
The hearing?
Yeah.
Like I said, Ed LeBlanc, the attorney, was there, and to me there was somebody else I didn't know, I can't remember, but Boris Bernard and his wife were there, Scottish parents. They may have been the one that, now what was the outcome of that, I never questioned those people. I have no idea if they got any compensation of any kind.
Yeah. And the hearing was held in what town?
It was in the courthouse in Abbeville. And I think it was, I'm trying to think what room it was in. It probably was in the district attorney's office, if I'm not mistaken. Don't quote me on that because I'm not sure. It was quite a few years back. But I think Mrs. Joe Brown probably got something because Dr. Sweet told me, he says, I turned it into the insurance. And there was a fellow that came and asked me if I was right in stating that we had deputized Joe Brown. I guess it was an insurance man that had come. And I guess he probably got compensated as being a town employee or some kind, because Joe Brown was a councilman. In fact, he was a mayor pro tem of and we had appointed him as deputy because he knew how to arrest somebody. He had been a military policeman. He had been a deputy sheriff. So, and I wouldn't have known the first procedure in arresting anybody had we seen anybody breaking the law. And we were patrolling the town.
Now, where were the bodies placed for the funeral?
After the funeral?
No.
Or prior to the funeral? Well, they were placed in church. 8 bodies lined up in church.
In the front.
In front of the church.
And I'm sure they were all closed caskets.
Right, and the funeral started off, as I said, as I had Governor McKeith in the car with me. That's when they started the funeral. When I came back, well, the church was overflowing naturally, and I couldn't get in. But it was a sad thing. I could hear Father Labbe speaking. I mean, that I remember well. You know, but I still think about it on a daily basis, I'm sure.
They had to have called in other priests to come for the funeral?
Well, all I remember, Father Labbe and Father Swallow, who was one of the assistant pastor, and Monsignor Barabee.
And Father Dupree was there too, I remember.
Father Dupree came
he had just left. He had been in the parish, but he had just been reassigned to.
He had been reassigned. That's when
Rain.
Father Swallow had come.
Yes.
That I can't remember that much. I mean, but
Do you remember how many gallons of water they were supposed to have in the water
there was
tower?
40,000 gallons. And I remember on my way back when I came to get the jack, that water was still flowing on Broadway. In other words, my truck was still finding that water flowing.
But it was dark that night.
No, it was before dark. Well, it was about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I mean, that's about when it happened. It was not dark yet. Because I was looking through the tower to see if my antenna on my business had collapsed like most of them in town.
Your
It had
business,
not.
and your business was a radio and television shop where
Well,
Cashway Pharmacy is
right.
now. And you had the antenna on a trailer behind the shop.
That's how I happened to see that that first Gawa snap, because I was looking through the tower at the time. I just happened to be looking for my antenna. That's why I happened to see it. Mm-hmm. And that Gawa, I didn't know whether that Gawa would reach me or not. Mm-hmm. It swung coming out. And then I saw the tower twisting, was slowly coming down. It is,
When Daddy told me the story, he told me that he could hear, after the water tower crashed, he said he could hear people screaming for help. Do you remember that?
no, I didn't hear anything like that. You see, I wanted to park on Lasky, no, Edwards, on Edwards Street, and I made sure I had good communication. I had my message out before coming back, and that's when Wilmer had heard me, and he was back, and he met me in front there if I had the jacks. He had heard me, and he had come back in time to hear me.
And then you had the jacks. What did y'all do with the jacks?
Well, they lifted the beams to
free Marshall.
get Marshall out and Joe Schickschneider.
So you weren't actually doing that.
Was that?
Did you help them do that?
No, I stayed in my truck.
Yeah.
No. I was not in no position to walk because I had a sprained ankle. No, I didn't get out of my truck until...
You mentioned Western Auto, and Western Auto was right on the side where
Right.
the bar is right now.
That's that building, that's that cafe that Guidry has now. That was a Western Auto building.
And when you mentioned the other water tower, that was the water tower for the refinery,
Yeah, the refinery
the
had a water
sugarcane
tower.
refinery.
It was a smaller tower, probably held maybe 10,000 gallons, I guess. 10,000 gallons. But it's not, they have since dismantled it. But
And your message, your CB message must have gotten out because I heard that the water tower had fallen. I was listening to a radio, and it was on a New Iberia station. And I heard, before you came back to tell us, I heard on the radio that the water tower in Erath had fallen. So we already knew before you came back. And we didn't know if you were in there. We thought you were in the city hall.
yeah, but C.B. LeBlanc at his home, his sister in California called him before he knew the water tower had fallen. In other words, asked for news, so he had no news to give him.
Do you remember if you were able to watch the national news
No, I didn't.
the next few days?
No, I didn't watch TV for
We had no
maybe 2
electricity.
weeks.
Right. Do you know if this story made national news? Or you just have a hunch?
I have a hunch it did, but I never had an opportunity. Like I said, when I'd get home, I'd go to bed. I mean, I was busy as a bee.
And people had been killed in La Rose.
Yeah, La Rose,
There
they had
were
a tornado.
tornadoes.
That killed several people there that morning.
That news was big too.
I know that made national news. We had it on TV. We knew about it before the tower fell here.
And at City Hall, were there the fire trucks that got damaged also?
I don't think they were damaged. The water tower fell just before the trucks were parked one behind the other one. In other words, that was the fire station and City Hall. And they might have been trapped in there. I don't know whether they were able to move them out right away. I couldn't tell you right off.
How big you think City Hall was, the size of the building? It was
How
a very
big?
small building,
That
wasn't
was a small building.
Mm-hmm.
About what size you think?
Oh, maybe 40 by 40, I guess, something like that. You take Lee Bernard probably could tell you really the dimension because he was the first fire chief we had. And I don't remember who the fire chief was at the time.
And the library had been right on the side of the city hall, and it had just been moved a few months before.
No, but the city hall, the library was that little building under the legs of the tower. That made a little building, and that was the first library, and that's where your daddy and Mr. Black and them were watching a TV when the tower fell. They had a generator that generated electricity and had the TV on, and that got crushed.
Yeah. So the library was a little separate building.
Right on the side of the city
Not on
hall.
the side, it was under the tower. And the tower was next to City Hall, you see?
That's it. So it was the library was on the side of the city hall.
Right. Under the tower legs.
Yeah, so if you drew a picture of the building, there would have been the library on the left, and then there was City Hall,
Right.
and then there was the
Fire trucks.
the two fire trucks parked there,
Right.
and then the Western Auto.
Western Auto, right. For a long time, you could still see the cradle where the tower had fell and crushed the concrete under City Hall, where the bulk of the water had fallen. It was I remember I didn't want my picture taken in any of that stuff, and there was some public official, when they pulled that leg out from there, they wanted me to stand there with take my picture. I turned my back to it. I mean, that was not something to.
Do you have you were telling me there's a scrapbook that y'all have?
Mama has a scrapbook.
Yeah, she collected all the information.
I'll get it.
I learned a lot of things. There were errors in natural anything that's written. As a rule, there are always errors in it. They claimed that I was the one that had rescued Marshall. I did not. I provided the jacks. That was the extent. Because like I said, I was a cripple to begin with. I wouldn't have gotten in anybody's way. That's what it would have been. But Wilmer Dugard was Joe Brown's son-in-law. You can imagine the feeling there, you know, with him.
When you said you left City Hall to right before the tower fell, about how many minutes you think you were in City Hall before it fell? Within an hour?
Oh, that I had been in there? Oh, maybe 15, 20 minutes at the outside. See, all I had time was I left City Hall, I went to the store, and immediately Bessie met me at the door to come here and get some water for them to make coffee. And that's what I came here and got coffee. I passed around the house here, see if any damage. All I could hear in the back, we have some plywood paneling on the wall instead of sheetrock. That paneling was cracking, going back and forth. You know, the wind was pulling back and forth. I was afraid the house would tear up on the other end, but it didn't. And I picked up the jacks. I picked up the water, went back out there, but I didn't get there with the water. The tower fell before, and I didn't bring the water there until...
It had been quite a while because we were worried about you.
In another, perhaps maybe 5 or 10 minutes, you might have been inside City Hall with the water.
I probably would have... No, I was bringing the water to the store, you see. But I probably would have come back with the group because we're almost like a big family, you know. We all had the same problem. The only thing that saved me because my family was in town.
And that was the first time we had ever left the house during a hurricane. We always stayed.
We always stayed here.
And they had invited us to go. That was the big store, not the smaller store. That was where that bar is now. So we were all in there.
And to close it up, this happened in 1963, and you would have been...
1964.
1964. You would have been what age at that time?
Subtract 16 from that.
I was 17, and you're 30 years older than me.
So it'd be 47. 47, 48 years old.
And you were an elected official at that time?
Yeah, I was a member of the council. I've been a member of the council for a number of years. And it was, I guess Dr. Swear depended on me to do so many things because I was familiar with it. And,
Dr. Swear was the mayor.
Was that?
Dr. Swear was the mayor.
Yeah, he was the mayor. And
where was the chief of police and the police officers at that time when the water tower fell?
I don't know. I couldn't, I probably, if you'd asked me the next day, I probably could have, but today I can't tell you that.
Now, Wilma Wilma Dugas was a policeman for
he
the
was
town.
he was a policeman. He was not a. Edwin Lander was the chief of police at the time. I don't remember. I don't remember even who was the fire chief.
So a police officer was killed.
That was Cowboy.
Otto Bork,
Yeah, he was the
school crossing
school
guard.
crossing guard.
Mm-hmm.
He knew the name of every kid in school. I mean, amazing. He knew who the parents were and everything else.
The man you're talking about a while ago, Wilmer.
Dugas.
Okay, he wasn't a policeman.
He was a policeman.
Yeah, he was
then.
a policeman, a hired policeman.
Oh, but he didn't get killed.
No,
No.
he was in the group that.
He had accompanied the people who were taking care of the branches on Mr. Mayo Segura's home.
Right. Right. So the only official that really got killed was the member who was the councilman.
Joe Brown and the policeman,
And Otto Bork.
Cowboy,
Cowboy. Yeah. Cowboy was employed by the city.
by the city, right?
Mm-hmm.
What about Duris
Who?
or no Duffy?
Well, he was just he was
He didn't work for the town
no
for the
no
electrician.
no. His employment was with Boudreaux and Gary. One of the boys, the two Broussard boys, one worked for Boudreaux and Gary, and the other worked for Sugar LeBlanc. In other words, they were two brothers that worked for two hardware stores. Both of them were killed. Two brothers.
And if we could go through the names of all the people, you went through about 3 of them. Who are some of the other people who died and what they did for a living?
Well, there was Clifton Dugas, and then there was
Nunu Maynard.
Judu Maynard.
He was a school
Nunu Maynard
janitor.
was a school janitor.
Yes.
And then there was Felix Dubois, who was a farmer in town. He had his family had they gone to Dr. LeBeouf's, I think? I think that's where they were. In other words, what was the connection there? Oh yeah, Grant was married to one of the daughters. I think
Alice.
that's how it came about. And, but anyway, let's see who else. There were 8. Joe Brown, Cowboy, Clifton, the 2 Broussard boys,
Scotty.
Nunu Maynard, and Dubois. There's another one missing there. Oh yeah, Scotty. And Scotty Bernard.
Scotty was about what age?
Scotty was about 18 and 19. He was
He was a
year-
freshman in college.
No, he would have been a sophomore. He was a class ahead of me. I had just graduated in May, and Scotty and Duffy's brother were a class ahead of me. They had graduated in '63.
What was Duffy's brother's name?
Vernis.
Vernis,
Vernis.
right. Vernis and Duffy. 2 Broussard
So
brothers.
they had been out of school a little over a year, out of high school.
And they were out with the group, getting all wet. And Duffy's the one that had gone home and changed his clothes, came back in dry clothes, and he had the peculiar pants that I recognized his leg. It's chills come through you. Take, I don't know. The water tower for years. Whenever I'd back up, I'd look at the tower, see how high the gauge was in the tower. But now there's some vegetation growing. I can't see it as well now when I back out from here. I used to call that my tower. I guess in a way I could almost claim it, because it was a coincidence that those people had a tower ready to be installed, and we were able to get it.
About how long did it take
Before to get it?
before we got it?
Oh, it was several
in
months,
operation, yeah.
quite a few months. I would venture to say 4 months before it was installed and ready to go. Then we had to drill a water well too at the site. Stam Sheila, of course, drilled a water well. There was no problem. That's something else the government paid for. Paid for full installation and connection, new water well.
What about the new City Hall building?
Oh, the new city hall, oh, that's something else too. There we had no city hall. The Seymour Letters have their old store. So Dr. Swear said we can build city hall and at the same time build a new post office, which the federal government were willing to, because they wanted a new building for a post office in town. The town had outgrown the old.
And the post office then was where the Wild Iris is now.
Right. And so we negotiated with the federal government if we'd make the building according to their specification, they would rent it X number of years. I forgot. I don't know if there's even a limitation on it. Well, number one, the design came out, and we had hired Richard Meir as the architect. He's the one that had enlarged the church. At the time, the church was being enlarged.
Right.
And he was the architect for that. So we hired him to make the plans for City Hall, what we wanted. And so he made the plans. And when then we didn't have the first nickel for it. And I met Mr. Barone, who lived 2 doors down one day. He didn't even vote in town. He tells me, he says, I know where y'all can raise the money. He says, get a sales tax. That was the first time, so I mentioned it to other people, and some say, well, how will you get it in time to have the money? Because we had to have the money, and for there was some limitation on the time. We had to have those things built by a certain time for the government to participate. For instance, I think they paid for the new fire station and police station. I think the federal government paid for that. But for City Hall itself and the post office, that was new funds. So we were on pins and needles waiting for the election to come, see if we'd get the thing. We borrowed $75,000 to build City Hall and other needs that we had. And we had all the money placed. And the bids came up $10,000 higher than we had allocated funds for. So I talked to, what was the name, a contractor from Kaplan, a fellow I know well. He was Joe Brown's brother-in-law. They had married sisters. I met him on the street in Abbeville one day, and I told him my predicament. He said, well, just re-advertise. I said, well, we could eliminate certain things. Don't eliminate anything. Advertise with the same bid. And sure enough, we came back, and the same 5 bidders came back in the same line. The lowest was still the lowest. And he was under contract money that we had allocated for it. But there were shortcuts taken. Number one, that was, by that time when it got complete, it was in the winter months. I forgot when. But by the time we started the air conditioner, come to find out the air conditioner didn't work so hot. And both in City Hall and the post office. Come to find out they had shortchanged, they didn't put any, what do you call those?
Ducks.
Ducts. Didn't put any ducts in the, for the return. They just take the hot air out of the attic and pass it through the air conditioner. It's just like putting hot water in your ice maker, I guess. It would be about the same thing. There was just hot water coming out. So we hired Leo Bernard to correct that. That's where they had cut down on the bid money. Then something else they had cut down on, they had not waterproofed the walls. The first big rainwater started coming through the walls. We had to get some, I think it's silicone, some kind of silicone composition they applied to the bricks, keep water from coming through the bricks.
The water tower fell in October and City Hall was demolished. When did the new City Hall open up?
That's what I don't remember. It was in the spring sometime, I guess. And we had so many months to rebuild in order for federal
There's
participation.
a plaque. We could check
Yes.
the date.
And the last thing that I would ask you to answer, of your recollection of the history of Erath, and even what you have read, how would you list the biggest disasters to hit Erath? The water tower surely was one of them. What are the other disasters that you know of that hit Erath?
But the only thing is the floodings. It's the only thing I can see. In 1940, we had the flood in 1940. Incidentally, I was the last caller driving to Erath in 1940, in August. That's when I got a degree from Southwestern that night. And I was the only one in the family that had gone. And I couldn't come through Youngsville. I had to go through New Iberia to get back to Erath. When I got in Delcom, I stopped at the Grey Goose, took my shoes off because there was water. I walked in and told them, what's the possibility of going to Erath? There's no chance. They got trucks stopped along the highway. I was hard-headed. I got down and took my knife. I cut my fan belt to keep the fan from blowing water on my ignition system. And I drove into town. I couldn't drive too fast because the water would fall as a wave over my lights. I had to keep my speed to a certain extent. And I drove into town. I parked the car on the railroad track. It stayed there about a week. When I came to get it, the clutch was stuck. But on the way, one truck I recognized was a lumberyard truck. Great big lumberyard truck was stopped on the highway. I had to go around him. And I could only see like the vegetation along for, then I'd gone, and that's the only thing I could see where the highway was. Give you an idea how much water they had on the highway. Now one thing that puzzles me, the next morning I came and there was a Times Speaking one that had been delivered at the drugstore. I went on the step and I read the Times Speaking on that morning newspaper. How it got here, I still would like to know how it got here.